https://www.youtube.com/watch-ver J33HSAPNTGTC. In the harsh frontier of 1870s Montana Territory, Austin Calloway is a weathered cowboy struggling to keep his failing ranch alive after losing his family to disease. When a desperate widow named Margaret Sullivan arrives at his doorstep with her young son Thomas, she makes him an unexpected proposition that will change both their lives forever. Set against the backdrop of the unforgiving American West, this is a story of survival, unexpected alliances, and the powerful bonds that form when people need each other most. As Austin and Margaret navigate the challenges of frontier life, they discover that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the one you're born into. The Montana Territory stretched endlessly under a sky so vast it seemed to swallow a man's soul. Austin Calloway pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face as he guided his horse along the dusty trail leading to his ranch. The year was 1874 and the land was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Purple mountains rose like ancient guardians in the distance, while golden grass swayed in the persistent wind that never seemed to rest in this corner of the world. Austin's ranch sat in a valley that had once been green with promise. Now, after 3 years of drought and 2 harsh winters that had claimed most of his cattle, it looked more like a monument to broken dreams than a working homestead. The wooden fence posts leaned at odd angles, and the barn roof had more holes than a politician's promises. At 35, Austin felt twice his age, his hands cracked and calloused from years of hard work that seemed to yield less and less with each passing season. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Austin spotted something unusual near his cabin. A covered wagon sat in his yard, its canvas top yellowed with dust and travel. 2 horses stood hitched to it, their heads hanging low with exhaustion. Austin's hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip. In this territory, unexpected visitors could mean trouble, and trouble was something he couldn't afford any more of. As he drew closer, he could make out 2 figures sitting on his porch steps. A woman in a faded blue dress and a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The woman stood as Austin approached, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. She was probably in her late 20s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and green eyes that held a mixture of desperation and determination that Austin recognized all too well. "Mr. Calloway," she called out, her voice carrying a slight Irish accent that spoke of a heritage from across the ocean. "I'm Margaret Sullivan, and this is my son Thomas. I was told in town that you might be willing to listen to a proposition." Austin dismounted slowly, studying the pair with the careful attention of a man who had learned that survival often depended on reading people correctly. The boy Thomas had his mother's green eyes but darker hair, and he clutched a small wooden horse carved with obvious skill. His clothes were patched but clean, and despite the weariness that marked both mother and son, there was something resilient about them that reminded Austin of saplings that bend in the storm but refuse to break. "Depends on the proposition," Austin replied, his voice rough from disuse. He lived alone out here, and some days the only conversation he had was with his horse or the occasional coyote that ventured too close to the cabin. "And it depends on who told you where to find me." Margaret lifted her chin, a gesture that spoke of pride barely held in check. "Samuel Barnes at the general store. He said you'd lost your family and might understand what it means to need help. I lost my husband 6 months ago to lung fever, and we've been traveling ever since looking for a place to start over." The mention of family hit Austin like a physical blow, just as it always did. 3 years ago, the fever had taken his wife Emma and their infant daughter Mary within a week of each other. He'd buried them on the hill behind the cabin, under the shade of the only cottonwood tree for miles around. Some nights, when the wind was right, he could swear he heard Emma's voice calling to him from that hillside. "I'm sorry for your loss," Austin said, and he meant it. Death was too common a visitor in this harsh land for anyone to take it lightly. "But I'm not sure what kind of help you think I can provide. As you can see, this place isn't exactly thriving." Margaret took a deep breath, and Austin could see her gathering her courage for whatever she was about to say. "Mr. Calloway, I'll speak plainly because I don't have time for dancing around the truth. I need a husband and you need a strong son." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a campfire. Austin felt his world tilt slightly, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly shifted. He'd been expecting perhaps a request for work, or maybe food and shelter for the night. He certainly hadn't been expecting a marriage proposal from a complete stranger. "Ma'am," Austin began, but Margaret held up a hand to stop him. "Please let me finish," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I know how this sounds, but hear me out. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, and help with the ranch work. I've been doing it all myself since Patrick died. Thomas is young, but he's strong for his age and eager to learn. We need protection and a home, and you need help to make this place work again." Austin looked at the boy, who was watching the exchange with eyes that seemed too old for his young face. There was no shame in Thomas's expression, only a quiet acceptance of his mother's desperation that spoke of a maturity forced upon him by circumstances beyond his control. "This is a hard life out here," Austin said slowly. "Harder than most folks back east can imagine. The winters can kill you. The summers can drive you mad. And there's always something trying to take what little you've managed to build." "And do you think our life has been easy?" Margaret replied, her Irish temper flashing briefly before she controlled it. "We've been sleeping in that wagon for 2 months, working odd jobs and barely scraping together enough money for supplies. I've seen my boy go to bed hungry more nights than I care to count. At least here we'd have a roof over our heads and a chance to build something." Austin walked to the edge of his porch and looked out over his land. The cabin was solid enough, built from logs he'd cut himself when he first came to this valley with Emma. It had 2 rooms, the main living area with a stone fireplace and a smaller bedroom where he and Emma had planned to raise their children. The barn needed work, but the bones of it were good. With help, real help, he might actually be able to make something of this place again. "Why me?" he asked, turning back to face Margaret. "Surely there are other men in town who might be interested in a wife." Margaret's laugh was bitter. "Mr. Calloway, I'm a widow with a child, and no dowry except these 2 hands and whatever strength I have left. The men in town looking for wives want young girls with fathers who can offer land or money. I'm offering a partnership, pure and simple. A chance for both of us to survive in a place that doesn't much care whether we live or die." Thomas stepped forward then, his small voice clear in the evening air. "Mister, my ma is real good at fixing things. She fixed our wagon wheel 3 times on the way here, and she can make bread that actually tastes good even with bad flour." Despite everything, Austin found himself fighting back a smile. The boy had his mother's courage, that was certain. He looked again at Margaret, taking in the determined set of her shoulders and the way she stood protectively near her son. She wasn't beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about her strength, something that reminded him of the kind of woman it took to survive on the frontier. "This wouldn't be a real marriage," Austin said carefully. "Not at first, anyway. You'd have your own space, and we'd both need time to figure out if this arrangement could work." Margaret nodded. "I understand. I'm not asking for love, Mr. Calloway. I'm asking for a chance." The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn and sending dust devils dancing across the yard. Austin thought about the long, lonely nights ahead, the endless cycle of barely getting by, the slow decay of everything he'd worked to build. Then he thought about having help, having purpose again, having voices in his cabin instead of just the howling of the wind. "All right," he said finally. "We'll try it for a month. If it doesn't work out, I'll give you supplies and help you get to the next town." Margaret's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging slightly as tension she'd been carrying for months finally began to ease. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. You won't regret this. Call me Austin," he said, "and I sure hope you're right about that. If you're enjoying this tale of courage and determination in the Old West, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of the American frontier. And don't forget to comment below and let us know where in the world you're listening from. We love hearing from our global audience. The first morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering the grass like scattered diamonds. Austin had spent a restless night on the floor of the main room, having given up his bedroom to Margaret and Thomas. He'd lain awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of other people in his home, the soft murmur of a mother's voice comforting her child, the creak of floorboards under different footsteps, the rustle of fabric as someone moved in their sleep. After 3 years of solitude, these simple human sounds seemed almost foreign. He rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to begin the morning chores. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and the distant promise of snow from the mountains. Austin had always found peace in these early morning hours, when the world belonged to him alone and the day's possibilities stretched ahead unmarked by disappointment or failure. But this morning was different. As he walked toward the barn to check on his remaining cattle, he heard the cabin door creak open behind him. Margaret emerged, her auburn hair braided down her back, and a heavy woolen shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to early rising, and Austin found himself wondering about her life before, about the husband she'd lost, and the journey that had brought her to his doorstep. "Good morning," she said softly. her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. I thought I might help with the morning work. Austin paused, uncertain. He'd grown used to doing everything himself, moving through his routines with the mechanical precision of a man who had no one to consider but himself. The idea of having help, of having to coordinate with another person, felt strange and slightly uncomfortable. I usually start with the cattle, he said finally. Check for any problems during the night. Make sure they have water. Margaret nodded and fell into step beside him. Patrick kept cattle too back in Kansas. 20 head before the drought took most of them. I know the signs of sickness and injury well enough. They worked together in companionable silence, moving among the small herd that represented the remnants of Austin's once prosperous ranch. He had only 12 head left, a mix of longhorns and shorthorns that had proven hardy enough to survive the recent harsh years. Margaret proved as knowledgeable as she'd claimed, quickly identifying a small cut on one animal's leg and helping Austin clean and dress the wound. This one's favoring her right front foot, Margaret observed, pointing to a young heifer. Might be a stone bruise or an abscess forming. Austin examined the animal and found she was right. It was a small thing, easily missed if you weren't paying attention, but it could have led to serious problems if left untreated. He found himself impressed by Margaret's keen eye and gentle hands as she helped him check the hoof. Thomas appeared as they were finishing with the cattle, his face still soft with sleep but his eyes bright with curiosity. He'd bundled himself into a coat that was clearly too large for him, the sleeves hanging well past his hands and the hem nearly reaching his knees. Can I help too? He asked, his voice small but eager. Ma taught me how to gather eggs and feed chickens if you have any. Austin looked down at the boy, seeing something of himself at that age, the desperate desire to be useful, to prove his worth to the adults whose approval meant survival. I've got 6 hens and a rooster, he said. They're probably wondering where their breakfast is. Thomas's face lit up with genuine pleasure and Austin felt an unexpected warmth in his chest. It had been a long time since he'd seen such simple joy in accomplishing a task. He led the boy to the chicken coop, a sturdy structure he'd built during his first year on the ranch, when hope had run as high as his ambitions. While Thomas scattered grain for the chickens with the serious concentration of someone determined to do the job right, Austin and Margaret continued their survey of the ranch. The property encompassed nearly 200 acres of grazing land, with a creek that ran year-round even during the driest seasons. It was good land, Austin knew, with potential that he'd never been able to fully realize on his own. The south pasture fence needs mending, Austin said, pointing toward a section where several posts had begun to lean dangerously, and the roof on the barn has some weak spots that need patching before the snow flies. Margaret studied the fence line with a practiced eye. I can help with the fence work. Patrick taught me to set posts and string wire properly. As for the roof, I'm comfortable working up high if you don't mind a woman doing that kind of work. I don't mind anyone doing work that needs doing, Austin replied, and he meant it. The frontier had a way of stripping away social conventions in favor of practical necessity. He'd known plenty of women who could outwork most men when circumstances demanded it. They spent the morning walking the property, cataloging what needed immediate attention and what could wait until spring. Margaret asked intelligent questions about water rights, grazing rotation, and the local market for cattle. Her questions revealed a deeper understanding of ranch operations than Austin had expected, and he found himself relaxing into a conversation that felt more like a business partnership than an awkward arrangement between strangers. The previous owner of our place in Kansas ran sheep as well as cattle, Margaret explained as they examined the creek that formed the northern boundary of Austin's land. Patrick said it was a mistake to put all your hopes in one kind of livestock. Sheep can survive conditions that would kill cattle, and wool brings steady money even when beef prices drop. Austin had considered sheep before but had always dismissed the idea. Cattle ranching was what real men did in Montana Territory. Sheep were for farmers and foreigners. But listening to Margaret's practical assessment, he began to see the wisdom in diversification. Pride, he realized, was a luxury he could no longer afford. When they returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Austin was surprised to find that Margaret had somehow managed to prepare a substantial lunch, despite spending the morning outside. The cabin smelled of fresh bread and coffee, and a pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the small space with warmth and the comforting aromas of home cooking. How did you manage this? Austin asked, genuinely puzzled. The morning had felt full with no time for cooking. Margaret smiled for the first time since her arrival, and Austin was struck by how the expression transformed her face. I started the bread last night and put the stew on before we went out this morning. My grandmother always said a good meal was half preparation and half timing. They sat around Austin's small wooden table, and for a moment, The cabin felt alive in a way it hadn't since Emma's death. Thomas chattered about the chickens, excited to report that he'd found 4 eggs, and that the rooster had seemed to approve of his corn-scattering technique. Margaret asked Austin about the history of the ranch, listening with genuine interest as he described the early days when he and Emma had first arrived in the valley. "We came here in '69, Austin said, surprised by how easy it felt to talk about Emma without the usual stab of pain. Emma saw this valley and said it looked like a place where dreams could take root. She had a way of seeing the potential in things that others might overlook. She sounds like a wise woman," Margaret said quietly. Thomas's father was the same way. He could look at the most barren piece of ground and describe the farm it would become. "Sometimes I think dreamers see the world more clearly than the rest of us." After lunch, they turned their attention to more immediate concerns. Austin showed Margaret and Thomas around the inside of the cabin, explaining the quirks of the wood stove and the best way to manage the temperamental pump that brought water from the well. The cabin was larger than it had first appeared, with a good-sized main room that served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, plus the single bedroom and a small root cellar that stayed cool year-round. "We can set up a bed for Thomas in the main room," Margaret suggested. "There's space near the fireplace that would be warm and comfortable." Austin nodded, though he was already thinking about the longer-term sleeping arrangements. If this partnership was going to work, they'd need more space and more privacy. The cabin could be expanded. He'd always planned to add another room when children came along. The thought brought a familiar ache, but also surprisingly a glimmer of possibility. As the afternoon wore on, they began the process of unloading Margaret's wagon. She didn't have much. Some clothes, basic cooking utensils, a few books, and several quilts that had clearly seen better days but were still serviceable. Thomas's possessions fit into a single small crate. More clothes that had been carefully mended, the carved wooden horse Austin had noticed the day before, and a collection of smooth stones that the boy explained he'd gathered during their travels. "Each one is from a different place," Thomas said seriously, arranging the stones on the mantelpiece with the careful precision of a collector. "Ma says it's good to remember where you've been, even when you can't go back." As evening approached, Austin found himself feeling cautiously optimistic for the first time in months. The work had gone smoothly. The conversation had been easy, and there was something deeply satisfying about having purpose beyond mere survival. Maybe Margaret had been right when she'd called it a partnership. Maybe they could build something together that none of them could achieve alone. But as darkness fell and they prepared for their second night under the same roof, Austin felt the familiar weight of uncertainty settling over him like a heavy blanket. Good days were easy enough. It was the hard days that would test whether this arrangement was built on solid ground or shifting sand. The first real test of their arrangement came 3 days later when a late autumn storm swept down from the mountains with unexpected fury. Austin woke to the sound of wind howling around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the windows and sending drafts through every small gap in the walls. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees overnight, and when he peered outside, he could see snow beginning to mix with the driving rain. "Storm's moving in fast," he announced, as Margaret emerged from the bedroom, already dressed despite the early hour. "We need to get the cattle to shelter before it gets worse." Margaret nodded, her expression immediately serious. She'd lived on the frontier long enough to know that weather could turn deadly without warning. "I'll wake Thomas and get him settled with some breakfast. Then I'll come help." "No need," Austin began, but Margaret was already shaking her head. "With respect, Mr. Calloway, 2 people can move cattle twice as fast as 1. And if this storm is as bad as it looks, we'll need every minute we can get." Austin wanted to argue, but he could see the logic in her words. More than that, he could see the quiet determination in her eyes, the same look Emma used to get when she'd made up her mind about something. It was both comforting and unsettling to recognize that familiar stubbornness in another woman. They worked quickly to prepare for the day ahead. Margaret woke Thomas gently, explaining that he needed to stay inside and keep the fire going while they dealt with the storm. The boy accepted this responsibility with the same serious attention he gave to feeding the chickens, and Austin found himself impressed again by the child's maturity. Outside, the wind had picked up considerably, and the mixed rain and snow was turning to sleet that stung exposed skin like tiny needles. Austin's 12 head of cattle were scattered across the south pasture, and he could see they were already beginning to bunch together instinctively, seeking protection from the weather. "We'll drive them to the barn first," Austin shouted over the wind, "then move them to the shelter in the north pasture if we need more space." Margaret pulled her hat down low and nodded. She'd wrapped herself in a heavy coat and thick gloves, but Austin could see she was already shivering. Still, she moved with confidence as they approached the herd. positioning herself to help guide the animals toward safety. Moving cattle in good weather was challenging enough. In a storm with animals that were already nervous and spooked, it became an exercise in patience and persistence. The longhorns, true to their nature, proved stubborn and independent, while the shorthorns huddled together and refused to move until directly pressured. Austin found himself genuinely impressed by Margaret's skill with the animals. She seemed to understand instinctively how to position herself to encourage movement without causing panic. When one young bull tried to break away from the group, she was there to turn him back with a well-placed wave of her hat. When an older cow stumbled in the increasingly muddy ground, Margaret was quick to help steady the animal and keep her moving. They worked together with an efficiency that surprised Austin. There was no need for lengthy explanations or repeated instructions. Margaret seemed to anticipate what needed to be done and moved to do it without hesitation. It was the kind of wordless cooperation that usually took years to develop between partners. By the time they got the last of the cattle safely into the barn, both Austin and Margaret were soaked through and shivering. The storm had intensified while they worked, and what had started as mixed precipitation was now coming down as genuine snow, large, wet flakes that clung to everything they touched. "That was well done," Austin said, as they stood in the barn doorway, catching their breath and watching the storm rage outside. "I couldn't have managed it half as well on my own." Margaret pushed a strand of wet hair back from her face and smiled. "Patrick always said moving cattle was like dancing. You have to know when to lead and when to follow the music." They made their way back to the cabin through snow that was already beginning to accumulate on the ground. Inside, they found Thomas tending the fire with the careful attention of someone who'd been given an important job. The cabin was warm and bright, and the smell of coffee suggested he'd also managed to keep the pot brewing. "You did good work, son," Austin said, ruffling the boy's hair as he passed. The endearment slipped out naturally, and Austin was surprised by how right it felt. Thomas beamed at the praise, his face glowing with pride at being called son by this quiet man, who was slowly becoming a fixture in his young life. While Margaret changed into dry clothes, Austin assessed their situation. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and the temperature was continuing to drop. If it kept up like this, they could be snowed in for several days. He checked their supplies of food, firewood, and lamp oil, mentally cataloging what they had and what they might need. "How are we fixed for provisions?" Margaret asked when she emerged from the bedroom, now dressed in a dry woolen dress and heavy stockings. "We should be fine for a week or more," Austin replied. "I always keep the pantry well stocked this time of year. And Thomas did good work gathering those eggs yesterday. They'll help stretch the other food." As if summoned by the mention of food, Thomas's stomach gave a loud rumble. The morning's work had built up an appetite in all of them, and Margaret set about preparing a substantial breakfast while Austin dealt with getting completely dry clothes and warming himself by the fire. The cabin felt different with all three of them inside, waiting out the storm. It was cozier somehow, more alive. Austin found himself watching Margaret as she moved around the small kitchen area, noting how she seemed to instinctively know where things belonged and how to make the most of the limited space. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, working on some kind of project with a piece of wood and his pocket knife. "What are you making there?" Austin asked, settling into his chair with a cup of hot coffee. "A whistle," Thomas replied, not looking up from his careful carving. "Pa taught me how before he got sick. He said every boy should know how to make music, even if it's just a simple tune." Austin watched the boy's small hands work the wood with surprising skill. There was something meditative about the careful, repetitive motions, and Austin found himself remembering his own father, teaching him similar skills during the long winters of his childhood in Ohio. "Would you like me to show you how to make the finger holes?" Austin offered. "My father taught me when I was about your age." Thomas looked up with bright eyes. "You know how to make whistles, too?" "Whistles, flutes. Even tried my hand at a fiddle once, though that didn't turn out so well," Austin said with a chuckle. "Winter evenings can get long out here. A man needs something to keep his hands busy besides just reading." They spent the morning working together on the whistle while Margaret prepared their meal and tended to various household tasks. Austin found himself surprised by how natural it felt to be teaching someone again. He'd almost forgotten the satisfaction that came from passing on knowledge and watching understanding dawn in another person's eyes. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of weather was developing. Conversation came easier now, flowing naturally from one topic to another. Margaret told stories about their journey west, about the characters they'd met along the way and the small kindnesses of strangers that had kept them going during the darkest moments. Austin found himself sharing memories of building the ranch with Emma, of their plans and dreams and the gradual realization that some dreams need to be modified to match reality. Thomas proved to be a good listener, asking thoughtful questions that showed he was thinking seriously about what the adults were saying. When Austin told a story about a particularly ornery bull that had taken 3 men and 2 horses to catch, the boy wanted to know why they didn't just leave the bull alone if he was so much trouble. Sometimes, Austin explained, you have to deal with difficult situations because ignoring them will only make things worse later on. That bull could have hurt the other cattle or damaged the fences if we'd just let him run wild. Like when Ma says we have to fix problems instead of hoping they'll go away on their own, Thomas said, nodding seriously. Exactly like that, Margaret confirmed from the kitchen. Problems don't usually solve themselves. As the day wore on, Austin began to see patterns in how the 3 of them functioned together. Margaret was naturally organized and efficient, but she also had a gift for anticipating what others needed before they asked. Thomas was curious and eager to help, but he was also remarkably good at entertaining himself when the adults needed to focus on other things, and Austin found himself relaxing into a role he hadn't played in years, not just the solitary survivor he'd become, but someone who was part of a larger whole. The storm finally began to ease as evening approached, though the snow continued to fall steadily. They'd accumulated nearly 8 inches, and the temperature showed no signs of rising. But inside the cabin, gathered around the table for supper, Austin felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Tomorrow we'll need to check on the cattle again, he said as they finished their meal. Make sure they have enough feed and that the barn roof is holding up under the snow load. I can help with that, Margaret said. And Thomas can gather more eggs if the chickens are willing to brave the weather. They're tough old birds, Austin replied. They'll be fine as long as the coop stays warm and dry. As they cleaned up from supper and prepared for another night, Austin realized that somewhere during the day, his thinking had shifted. Instead of wondering whether this arrangement would work, he was already planning how to make it work better. Instead of thinking about Margaret and Thomas as temporary guests, he was beginning to see them as permanent fixtures in his life. The thought should have scared him. For 3 years, he'd protected himself from exactly this kind of hope. But as he listened to Margaret reading quietly to Thomas by the fireplace, he found that hope felt less like a luxury he couldn't afford, and more like a necessity he'd been denying himself. The storm cleared overnight, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun. Austin woke to a silence so complete it was almost unsettling after months of autumn winds. When he stepped outside to check on the animals, his boots crunched through snow that came up to his shins, and his breath formed white clouds in the crisp air. The cattle had weathered the storm well, huddled together in the barn and showing no signs of distress beyond a general reluctance to venture outside. Austin spent the better part of an hour breaking ice from their water troughs and ensuring they had adequate feed for the day. The chickens, as predicted, had proven hardy, though they eyed the white expanse outside their coop with obvious suspicion. When he returned to the cabin, he found Margaret already working on breakfast, while Thomas sat at the table, carefully practicing his letters on a piece of slate. The domestic scene struck Austin with unexpected force. How normal it seemed, how right it felt to come inside from morning chores to find warm food and quiet companionship waiting. Roads will be impassable for at least a few days, Austin reported as he hung up his coat and hat. Maybe longer if we get another storm. That's fine by us, Margaret replied, not looking up from the griddle where pancakes were beginning to bubble and brown. We're not in any hurry to be anywhere else. The simple statement carried weight beyond its surface meaning, and Austin felt something settle in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For 3 years he'd grown accustomed to his own company, to the rhythm of solitary days punctuated only by the needs of his animals and the changing seasons. Now the thought of returning to that isolation felt less like peace and more like emptiness. After breakfast, they settled into the kind of easy routine that families develop naturally. Margaret took over the mending that had been accumulating in Austin's neglected sewing basket, her skilled fingers making quick work of tears and loose buttons. Thomas continued his letter practice, occasionally asking for help with difficult words. Austin sat by the window working on harness repairs while keeping an eye on the weather outside. Tell me about your family, Margaret said after they'd worked in comfortable silence for a while. Your parents, I mean. Were they farmers back east? Austin's hands stilled on the leather he was stitching. He'd grown so accustomed to avoiding personal topics that the question caught him off guard. But looking at Margaret's genuinely interested expression, he found the words coming easier than he'd expected. They were, in Ohio. Dad grew corn and wheat mostly, kept a few head of cattle. Mom took in sewing to help make ends meet. He resumed his stitching, the familiar motions helping him navigate the unfamiliar territory of sharing memories. Dad used to say the land back there was good for growing crops but not so good for growing dreams. Said a man needed more space to really make something of himself. Is that why you came west? Thomas asked, looking up from his slate. Partly, Austin admitted, but mostly it was Emma's idea. She had this notion that we could build something bigger out here, something that would last. She used to talk about having enough land for our children to inherit, maybe even grandchildren someday. The mention of Emma didn't bring the sharp pain it once had. Instead, Austin felt a gentler ache, like the memory of an old injury that only hurt when the weather changed. Margaret seemed to sense this shift because she continued the conversation naturally. She sounds like she had vision, Margaret said. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind for something uncertain. She did have courage, Austin agreed. More than I did sometimes. When things got difficult here, bad winters, cattle prices dropping, neighbors moving on, she was always the one who said we should stick it out, said anything worth having was worth fighting for. Thomas had returned to his letters, but Austin could see the boy was still listening. It occurred to him that Thomas had lived through his own share of loss and uncertainty, that perhaps hearing about other people's struggles and persistence might be somehow reassuring. What about your folks? Austin asked Margaret. Are they still back in Kansas? Margaret's face clouded slightly. They died when I was 17. Influenza epidemic swept through our town that winter. Took a lot of folks, including my parents and my younger brother. She didn't pause in her mending, but Austin could see the careful control in her movements. That's when I married Patrick. Not for love exactly, but because I needed somewhere to go and he needed someone to help raise Thomas. I'm sorry, Austin said and meant it. That must have been difficult. It was. But Patrick was a good man, and in time we did come to love each other. Not the passionate kind of love you read about in novels, but something solid and dependable. We were partners, you know. We worked toward the same goals. Austin understood that kind of love. It was what he and Emma had built together over the years. Something that started with attraction and shared dreams, but deepened into something more durable. The kind of love that could survive disappointment and loss, and still provide strength when it was needed most. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp crack from outside, followed by a heavy thudding sound. Austin immediately set aside his work and went to the window, his experienced ear recognizing the sound of a tree branch breaking under the weight of ice and snow. Sounds like it came from near the barn, he said, reaching for his coat. I'd better check to make sure nothing's blocking the doors or damage the roof. I'll come with you, Margaret offered, but Austin shook his head. No need. I'll just be a few minutes. Outside, Austin found that a large branch from the old oak tree near the barn had indeed snapped off, falling across the path they'd been using to reach the building. The branch was substantial, easily 8 inches in diameter and nearly 20 feet long, and covered with enough ice to make it dangerously heavy. It would need to be cleared before they could safely tend to the animals again. Austin spent the next hour sawing the branch into manageable pieces and moving them out of the way. It was hard, cold work that left him breathing heavily and grateful for the warmth of the cabin when he finally returned. Margaret had hot coffee waiting, and the simple gesture felt like the kind of thoughtfulness that came naturally to people who cared about each other. Everything all right? She asked as he warmed his hands around the steaming cup. Just a tree branch blocking the path. Nothing serious. Austin settled back into his chair, appreciating the way the cabin's warmth gradually seeped back into his chilled bones. But it got me thinking about something. Margaret looked up from her mending, waiting for him to continue. Winter's just getting started, Austin said. We'll probably have several more storms like this one before spring comes, and each one will bring its own challenges, keeping the water troughs clear, making sure the animals stay warm, maintaining the buildings. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It's the kind of work that goes better with 2 people. Are you saying you'd like us to stay through the winter? Margaret asked, her voice carefully neutral. I'm saying I think we could help each other, Austin replied. You need a place to stay and time to figure out your next step. I need help managing the ranch, especially during the hard months. It seems like a practical arrangement. But even as he spoke the words, Austin knew they weren't entirely true. Yes, the help would be valuable, and yes, Margaret and Thomas needed a place to stay. But there was more to it than mere practicality. Over the past few days, the cabin had come alive in ways he'd forgotten were possible. Meals had become conversations instead of solitary necessities. Evenings had purpose beyond simply passing time until sleep. The work felt less like drudgery and more like shared responsibility. Margaret studied his face for a long moment, and Austin had the feeling she was seeing through his carefully practical explanation to the deeper truth beneath. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but certain. "I think that would be good for all of us," she said. "Thomas has been happier these past few days than I've seen him since we left Kansas, and She paused, as if deciding how much to reveal. "I haven't felt this settled anywhere since Patrick died. Like maybe we could stop running and start building something again." Thomas looked up from his slate, sensing the importance of the conversation, even if he didn't fully understand its implications. "Does that mean we get to stay here? With Mr. Austin?" "If he'll have us," Margaret said, looking back at Austin. "I'd like that," Austin said simply. "I'd like that very much." The boy's face lit up with a smile that seemed to fill the entire cabin with warmth. He immediately returned to his letters with renewed enthusiasm, as if this confirmation of stability had freed him to focus on learning and growing instead of simply surviving. As the afternoon wore on, Austin found himself seeing their living situation through new eyes. What had started as a temporary convenience was becoming something more permanent, more intentional. They weren't just three people sharing space anymore. They were becoming a family unit with shared responsibilities and common goals. The realization should have terrified him. For 3 years, he'd protected himself from exactly this kind of emotional investment. But as he watched Margaret teach Thomas to darn socks while explaining the importance of making things last, Austin felt his old defenses crumbling away like ice in spring sunshine. Outside, the snow continued to fall gently, adding to the white blanket that covered their small corner of the Colorado territory. Inside, warmed by fire and companionship and the growing certainty that they were exactly where they needed to be, Austin Calloway began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was ready to try building a family again. Winter deepened as December gave way to January, bringing with it the kind of cold that made every breath visible and turned the creek into a ribbon of solid ice. But inside the Calloway cabin, warmth had taken root in ways that had nothing to do with the wood-burning stove. Austin woke each morning to the sound of Margaret moving quietly about the kitchen, starting coffee and breakfast before the rest of them stirred. Thomas had claimed the small loft space as his own, and his cheerful chatter drifted down each morning as he dressed for the day. These simple domestic sounds, which had once seemed foreign in Austin's solitary world, now felt as natural as sunrise. The arrangement that had begun as temporary convenience had evolved into something neither practical nor convenient. It had become necessary, in the way that breathing is necessary, or hope. "The Henderson place is up for sale," Margaret mentioned one morning over breakfast, her tone carefully casual as she buttered a piece of toast. "I saw the notice when Mr. Jenkins stopped by yesterday." Austin looked up from his eggs, recognizing the weight behind her seemingly offhand comment. The Henderson farm was only 5 miles east, close enough to maintain their connection, but far enough to provide independence. Jim Henderson had given up after his wife died in childbirth, deciding he couldn't manage both the farm and his grief. "Good land," Austin said carefully. "Jim kept it in fine condition. Thomas and I have been talking," Margaret continued, still not meeting his eyes directly. "We've been thinking it might be time to put down real roots somewhere." Austin felt his chest tighten. Over the past month, he'd grown comfortable with their arrangement, perhaps too comfortable. The thought of returning to solitude felt like contemplating amputation. But he also understood Margaret's need for independence, for a place that was truly theirs. "That makes sense," he said, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "You shouldn't have to depend on the charity of others indefinitely." Thomas, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "But I don't want to leave. Why can't we just stay here?" "We're happy here." Margaret's expression softened as she reached over to squeeze her son's hand. "Sweetheart, Mr. Austin has been very kind to us, but we can't impose forever. He has his own life to live." "But he likes having us here," Thomas protested, looking between the adults with the clarity that children often possess about emotional truths adults prefer to dance around. "Don't you, Mr. Austin? You smile more now, and you laugh at my jokes." Austin felt the boy's innocent honesty cut straight through his careful emotional defenses. Thomas was right. He did smile more, did laugh more, did feel more alive than he had in 3 years. But admitting that felt like stepping off a cliff with no guarantee of solid ground below. "Of course I enjoy your company," Austin said gently. "But your mother is right to think about your future. You need stability. A real home." "This feels like a real home," Thomas said stubbornly, and Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Austin rose to look out the window, recognizing the familiar figure of Doc Brennan, the traveling physician who made rounds through the scattered homesteads of their area. Behind him rode two other men Austin didn't immediately recognize. "Doc Brennan's here," Austin announced, reaching for his coat, probably making his winter check on folks. Outside, Doc Brennan dismounted with the stiff movements of a man who'd spent too many hours in the saddle during Colorado's harsh winter. He was a thin, weathered man in his 60s, whose gentle manner and unshakable competence had earned him respect throughout the territory. "Austin," Doc greeted him with a firm handshake. "Good to see you looking well. These gentlemen are Marshal Davies and Deputy Collins from Denver. They're tracking some men who robbed a bank up in Georgetown last month." Austin nodded to the lawmen, both of whom looked cold and tired. "Welcome. Come inside and warm up. Coffee's hot." Inside the cabin, Margaret quickly set out additional cups while Thomas watched the visitors with the wide-eyed curiosity of a boy who didn't often see strangers. Doc Brennan accepted his coffee gratefully, wrapping his weathered hands around the warm cup. "We're looking for 3 men," Marshal Davies explained, producing a piece of paper with rough sketches. "They hit the First National Bank in Georgetown on December 15th, got away with nearly $2,000, last seen heading south." Austin studied the sketches, but none of the faces looked familiar. "Haven't seen anyone matching these descriptions. Most folks around here are hunkered down for winter anyway." "That's what we've been hearing," Deputy Collins said, "but we figured it was worth checking with all the outlying ranches just in case." Doc Brennan was examining Thomas with professional interest. "How's this young man been feeling? Any coughs or fevers this winter?" "He's been fine," Margaret replied. "We've all stayed healthy, thank God." "Good, good. Winter ailments can be dangerous out here, away from medical help." Doc turned to Austin. "And how are you managing, Austin? I know the last few years have been difficult." Austin glanced at Margaret and Thomas, acutely aware of how their presence had changed his answer to that question. "I'm doing well, Doc. Better than I have in a long time." Doc's shrewd eyes took in the domestic scene, the extra place settings, the child's slate on the table, the obvious signs of a family in residence. His expression grew thoughtful, but he made no direct comment. The lawmen finished their coffee and prepared to continue their search, thanking Austin for the hospitality. Doc Brennan lingered a moment longer, pulling Austin aside. "You look good, son," the old physician said quietly. "More like the man I knew before." He didn't finish the sentence, but Austin understood. Sometimes the best medicine is the kind that can't be mixed in a bottle. After the visitors left, an awkward silence settled over the cabin. The marshal's questions about the bank robbery had reminded them all of the wider world beyond their small sanctuary, of the reality that their current arrangement was temporary and fragile. "I should ride into town tomorrow," Austin said finally. "Pick up supplies and check on any news about those robbers." "I'll come with you," Margaret said. "I need to send a letter to my cousin in Kansas, let her know where we are. And I should inquire about the Henderson place if I'm serious about it." Austin nodded, though the thought of Margaret actively pursuing independence felt like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. That evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Austin and Margaret sat by the fire in their usual spots, but the comfortable companionship of previous nights felt strained. "Austin," Margaret said finally, her voice soft in the firelight, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Austin looked up from the harness he was mending, meeting her serious gaze. "Do you want us to leave?" she asked. "Not what you think is proper or practical, but what you actually want." The question hung between them like smoke from the fire, impossible to ignore or wave away. Austin set down his work, knowing this moment had been coming for weeks, knowing that his answer would change everything between them. "No," he said quietly. "I don't want you to leave. The thought of going back to the way things were before, it feels like losing something precious I didn't even know I was looking for." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Then why are you so ready to help me find somewhere else to go?" "Because I'm scared," Austin admitted, the words coming out raw and honest. "Because caring about someone means risking losing them, and I'm not sure I could survive that again. Because what we have here feels too good to be real, and I keep waiting for something to go wrong." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, kneeling beside him so their eyes were level. "Austin Calloway, let me tell you something about survival. I've lost my parents, my brother, my husband. I've been left with nothing but a 7-year-old boy and whatever I could carry in a wagon. I know about loss, and I know about starting over." She reached out to touch his face gently, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "But I also know that living in fear of loss isn't living at all. It's just existing, just marking time until you die." And that's not what Patrick would have wanted for Thomas and me. And it's not what Emma would have wanted for you. Austin felt something crack open inside his chest. 3 years of carefully constructed walls crumbling away like snow in warm sunshine. What are you saying? I'm saying that if you want us to stay, really stay. Not as guests or charity cases, but as family. Then ask us. Margaret's voice was steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Ask us to be your family, Austin. Ask us to build something together that's meant to last. Austin looked into her eyes and saw the same hope and fear he'd been carrying. But he also saw strength, determination, and love freely offered. In that moment, he understood that Emma's final gift to him hadn't been death's release from responsibility. It had been the capacity to love again, to build again, to hope again. Margaret, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thomas, will you be my family? Will you help me turn this place into a real home again? Yes, she whispered, and then louder. Yes, of course, yes. From the loft came a sleepy voice. Does this mean we're staying forever? Austin and Margaret laughed through their tears, and Austin called back, Yes, son, we're staying forever. And as spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the good earth beneath, Austin Calloway discovered that sometimes the greatest courage isn't found in facing the unknown, but in opening your heart to love again, in believing that broken things can be mended, and that families can be found in the most unexpected places. The cowboy who had frozen when she said she needed a husband had learned that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with riding toward the horizon, but with choosing to stay home. The end.